Hello, Same Wavelength fans, and happy October again. I've decided that the videos I make this month I want to be a little bit spooky. And so for my first book review video for the channel, I wanted to talk about the work of one of my favorite scientists slash science communicators. I believe his name is pronounced Bill Schutt. Um, and this book is incredibly near and dear to me. It's called Dark Banquet, Blood and the Curious Lives of Blood-Feeding Creatures. Very spooky. And this book is important to me because when I was 13, my grandmother, my dad's mom, took me to Skylight, which is the local bookstore in Los Angeles, where near where I live. And she basically was like, "You can buy whatever you want, and I'll pay for it." And so I got three books, and one was on neuroscience, one was on Isaac Newton, and one was this book. And the three of those really sort of transformed the things I was interested in and what I wanted to study. The Isaac Newton book was about alchemy and the scientific revolution and all of these things that I had really no sort of contact with or perception of before I was 13. And the neuroscience book was, I'll talk about it later, but it was a Douglas Hofstadter book that was about um, sort of neuroscience and philosophy. And these are all things that I've pursued throughout my life. I have I did a little very tiny amount of bat research after college. So I've done a little bit of everything from those three books, and they're a very large part of who I am. So this book in particular um, really spoke to me because I'm very specific about the sort of tone and voice of the writer for whatever book I read, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And I find myself able to like sink more into the content of a book if the writer is writing a little bit about their personal life. I think that's like a contemporary trend with nonfiction books is to like lead the reader on a journey with the author. And two, I love wit and snark, and there are plenty of jokes throughout this book, which is really cool. So this book is great. The author is a scientist, and he has spent many years working with bats specifically. And so this book is about his sort of journey both in and outside of a lab, like working with bats out in the real world too, which is super exciting. And specifically vampire bats. I really didn't know anything about bats other than that they're in Scooby-Doo when I got this book. And so it was super exciting to learn, first of all, that there's three kinds of vampire bats. There's just three living species, and there's over 1,000, way more than 1,000 species of bats in general. And that none of the vampire bats live anywhere near America, North America. So, it was this sort of awakening into this kind of science and this kind of life path that so many people have taken that's completely foreign to me until later after I graduated college and I got to work with bat scientists, and that was super cool. So this book is great. It goes into sort of the history of vampire bats, some folklore. It talks about leeches. It talks about sort of the medical use of leeches up until relatively recent times. Actually, I think some leeches are still used medically, but not in a gruesome way and an, ethical way. The humans, at least, if not the leeches. Um, and it's cool. Animals feeding solely off of blood is not very common. So this is a great book. I highly recommend it. And that is not the end of my review because basically since getting this book, I have collected the other books that this dear scientist has written. I think he also has a few novels out, which I haven't read, but these are the nonfiction books, which I am a big fan of. And I'm going to go through them very quickly, and then talk a little bit about why this kind of work is important. So I'm pretty sure the next one that came out was cannibalism. And I remember um, this book came out either when I was in college or when I was recently graduated. And I was living in San Francisco or near San Francisco. It came out in 2017. So this would have been right before I graduated college. Um, and I think I found it when I graduated because I was running around San Francisco as I did for several years. And there was a bookstore in Haight-Ashbury, which I think is not there anymore. It was one of the two Booksmith bookstores. And basically I ran across this and I was like, oh, this is like really fascinating. And I had been sort of cleaved from a lot of my science like interests and experiences. Sort of my arc as a human went from like being very sciencey as a teenager to very uh, philosophy, etc., artsy later, and I have sort of gone in and out of being sort of daily in contact with the sciences, if that makes sense. So, for example, this project that I'm doing is me reuniting with a former love, which is science. So, but anyways, I saw this book. I thought it was super interesting. I didn't even look at the name of the author. I just got it and I read through it like immediately. And it's more of a cultural anthropology that's both about human cannibals and myths about them, and of course, cannibalism in the animal world. So, of course, when I finished the book, I was like, why do I like this so much? This tone is really nice because it had been, if this was when I was 13, this is when I was maybe like 20, 7 years, a third of my life at that point in between reading these two. Um, and I looked up the author and I was like, oh my God, it's the same author as from when I was a kid. And like, this person um, sparked my creativity, or not my creativity, my interest in the sciences with the creative approach to writing. And that was super exciting to me. So I was like, okay, I need to read everything that's out by this guy. And then um, the one I read after that was his book on the heart. This one was super interesting because it feels like a much more limited scope of a book than the other ones because it's truly just about one organ. And that was absolutely fascinating to me because I was like, oh, like I'm actually learning a bit of chemistry and physics of how the heart works in different species. It goes through sort of an anthropological timeline, not anthropological, historical and scientific timeline of hearts in different species. So you have hearts that are less complicated, even though obviously they're not complicated, but like simpler to understand and has fewer parts in certain animals, and then it goes to the very complex hearts that we're perhaps more aware of because we have complex hearts as humans. So that's super interesting. And I think there's a quote in here that talks about how like no one type of heart is better than another. It's whatever is best for the organism. And if it's simple and that works best, then that's great. Um, and that sort of stuck with me, like this sort of concept that like all species have very different adaptations and different ways of living and operating in the world. And humans have a very uh, biased perception of what bits and pieces are good, often derived from like what we have or what we would like to have. Some people look at bats and birds and say, "Oh, I wish I could fly." But we still have this very like humanistic bias towards uh, whether something is good or not, or complex or not, or whatever. So that's kind of interesting. Those are thoughts that I hadn't really delved into either at all or since college when I'd taken my neuroscience classes and learned about different brains and different species. So that's super cool. And then most recently, and by that I mean like a month ago, I got this book and it made me want to do this video specifically because I was like, I've been entranced with this writing and this writing style for so many years, for um now, oh my gosh, 15 years. Um more than half of my life I've been interested in this kind of writing. And it's sort of unbelievable to me how um connecting with someone through stories, through writing, can really not only teach you scientific knowledge, but can also like sort of shape your worldview and your perception towards different things. I remember being in a photography class in college, and during the last day, we all had to like have a one-on-one with the professor, which was very daunting. And the professor asked, "What did you learn this semester, this quarter?" And I said something along the lines of, I'll never be able to look at the sky without thinking of how I have to burn it into a photograph going forward. And burning in that case, burning and dodging is how you use different tools to like allow more light through or less light through to a film photograph. And so at that point in my life, at least, and still a little bit today, like every time I look at the sky, I think about like um, that photographic work that I was making. And these books are kind of similar where like I read them and then I'm always thinking about maybe not every day I'm thinking about how the heart works, but when I have these things in my head, it gives me more of a touchstone to understand and analyze different things that are happening around me. I remember like the Heart book talked a bit about the role of, I think it was calcium in the body and how different calcium levels impact the heart. And since then, I haven't been able to look at like a food label or like anything without thinking about that. And just also how crazy it is that people don't really understand or aren't thinking about the ways in which uh, different things they consume or interact with are affecting their body because why would you? Why would you think about those things? Because you haven't been taught to think about them. So I'm a little all over the place in this video, but this one, the most recent one was about teeth, and how they have evolved in different species. And what I love most about these books is that they have little vignettes. It's not one continuous story. It's much in the same way that life on Earth is one continuous story, but like the ways in which we come to understand it are in bits and pieces. And it's sort of up to scientists to have this very large puzzle and connect it through storytelling to each other and to the public. Um, but it was so fascinating. I loved how the book started off with a discussion of vampire bats, very much bringing it full circle to the first book. Um, and it's super interesting. I mentioned in the last video, which I did on poison dart frogs, that I had been reading about snakes and venom, and that was from this. There's a whole chapter, at least, on um, how venom is brought into a victim through the bite of a snake, and how those venoms operate, and why, uh, venom is such a useful evolutionary adaptation and how it's very strong and quick and et cetera, et cetera. Um, I'm not doing these books justice, which is why you should all read them. Uh, but it's super fascinating to think that like different species have evolved really different ways to use their teeth, not just to eat things, but to do like other skills. Like you compare a venomous bite of a snake to what the vampire bats do, which is to make a little bite with their teeth, and then they don't like suck the blood up with their teeth, they lap it up with their tongues. There's your Halloween bit of information for the video. But it's fascinating how, we all have this thing in common, or many species have this thing in common. We all use it so differently. So, sort of what the reason I wanted to talk about these books in my first review uh, is not just that they were my introduction to science and the wonderful world of um, contemporary science, but and therefore I would like to introduce you to my world of science through these books, um, but also because I think the way these books are written really lends the reader to become enthralled with the work in this very humanistic way. You really do feel like you're going on a journey and you're in these remote places and you're handling these species. Um, and it's funny and it's contemporary. And I think based on the comments I've gotten on a lot of these videos, it's a very common issue that when getting into science, there's this sort of not cultural divide, but this division between these very heavy or difficult scientific topics and the very like lighthearted way that humans interact with each other. And I think if you can combine those successfully, whether you're Bill Nye making a TV show for children and adults, or you're Bill Schutt and you're writing these books to get the general public into something a little bit more scientifically complex and difficult, it's fabulous. And I think that's kind of the model I have for this show or this channel is that I, I'm sort of funny at some points, and I would like to think that my personality and my sort of ability to synthesize my experiences, the stuff I'm reading, research, etc., around me, um, comes through. And that seems to be a very good model when it comes to actually getting people to enjoy the sciences. So the way these books are written have always appealed to me since I was very young. Um, and they appeal to me now, even though I've changed so much and grown so much in the last 15 years. Um, wow, I feel very old. But they're really good, and I highly recommend them to anyone. If you're looking for just like a quick read to actually teach you something about the world, or if you're trying to actually find an entryway into the sciences, pop science books are the way to do it. I know some scientists tend to look down on pop science as not necessarily being inaccurate, but being uh, not uh, not showing the whole picture of like what goes on in science research, et cetera, et cetera. But pop science is always how I've accessed science in the past. I love, um, typical you go to a bookstore and the whole science wall is filled with like a million different books about space and astrophysics, and that stuff is very, um, limited in its scope of the actual like coding and math and the stuff that goes on behind the research, but the concepts are what's important to get more people hooked. And I think um, as much as I didn't like doing actual work and research in a physics context, I actually really did like doing the very brief amount of field work I did regarding bats. I basically like one day helped put up sonic recorders for bat calls in the Santa Cruz area, and a bunch of people were involved with this project. So when I left, it was fine. But um, people were doing this project to basically isolate different bat calls to understand which bat species were living in the area, which is something I think the government wanted to know, as well as the university. And that was a really difficult and interesting project because, unlike bird calls, which are very well recorded because there's so many birders out there, and birds on average are not nocturnal, except for, you think owls. Um, but basically it was much easier to get bird calls recorded than it was to get bat calls recorded. Um, Again, you have the same issue of like, is an animal making the same noise in captivity as it is making in the wild? So that kind of skews if you can capture a bat and you get its call, is that going to be the same noise that it's actually making outside? Who knows? Um, but the other issue is if it's pitch black outside, how are you going to get accurate photographs of the species that you're looking at? Now you can record its call and then capture the bat, but is that great or ethical? It's 100 different questions. So um, that work is super interesting and important. One of the things that Bill Schutt does in these books is that every like chapter there's a question he brings up, and he says, this would make for an excellent graduate study project. And I think that's also it very much humanizes the project of science by saying we have a ton of questions we don't have answers to. It takes a ton of research and a ton of different people together collaboratively to make science happen. And that's super exciting. So all of the other people in the world who are doing the actual science work, I'm very impressed by. Um, and while I'm not on that path, I'm very inspired and excited by those paths. Um, so yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope I inspire someone to read at least one of these. Dark Banquet is, of course, the closest one to my heart, even though one of these books is literally about the heart. Um, but it's the one that I recommend the most because it gave me so much joy when I read it. And the rest of these are phenomenal too. The work has, of course, stood the test of time and stood up. I read by last month, and I felt the same sort of joy and bewilderment reading it as I did reading the first book for the first time. Um, Although now I'm less open and naive and happy than I was when I was 13, although maybe that's a bit dark. So I'll leave on that. I really think everyone should read stuff like this, and I hope to do more of these book reviews in the future. I think the next one I'm going to do is going to be more artsy. It's probably going to be on books on color and gemstones from one of my other favorite writers who has a very different voice, but very similar writing pattern of taking the writer on a journey through this non-fictional work, but like with the author. So stay tuned for that, and I hope you have a great Wednesday.